There are mistakes you make and forget by the next morning. There are mistakes that stay with you, the kind that come back in the middle of an important meeting, in the silence between sleep and waking, in that embarrassing little moment when your brain decides to punish you without warning. And then there are mistakes that change everything, not because they are too big to ignore, but because they arrive at exactly the right time, in the right life, for the right person. Clara Bennett was 28 years old, lived in a tiny flat near the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, and had a brand new job that had lasted less than 24 hours when she made the kind of mistake that belonged in the third category. She did not know that yet. All she knew, at 11 o'clock on a freezing Monday night in October, was that she was exhausted, frustrated, her feet aching after an entire day standing in the restoration lab, and that she needed to vent to the only person in the world who understood her without judgment. Sophie Lawson, her best friend since she was 18, the woman who had once stayed on the phone with her for 4 hours, while Clara cried over a failed university exam. Clara typed the message without thinking, without checking the contact, without breathing. Sophie, my first day was a nightmare. The new director of conservation, Ethan Blackwood, he's arrogant, unbearable, as cold as the stones in that museum, and unfortunately, far too gorgeous for my emotional stability. She pressed send, dropped the phone on the bed, went to the bathroom to brush her teeth, came back, lay down, and fell asleep in less than 4 minutes. At 6:42 the next morning, when her alarm rang and she unlocked the screen to turn it off, she saw that the message had been sent, marked as read, to the wrong contact. The name on the screen was not Sophie. It was E. Blackwood, Director of Conservation, Royal Museum of Edinburgh. For 37 seconds, Clara remained completely still. Then, very methodically, she considered her options. Option 1. Pretend her phone had malfunctioned. Call the provider. Claim a high-level hacking incident. Disappear into witness protection. Option 2. Move countries. New Zealand was far enough. She could learn how to raise sheep. Option 3. Walk into the museum that day. Cross the marble halls. Pass the Egyptian sarcophagi. Reach the restoration lab. And simply work. Pretend nothing had happened, and hope Ethan Blackwood was the kind of man who ignored personal messages from incompetent employees. She was standing, dressed, and at the museum entrance by 8:15, 15 minutes early, when the director's assistant appeared in the corridor of the restoration wing with the kind of polite, slightly apologetic smile that could only mean one thing. "Director Blackwood would like to see you," the assistant said. "Now, if possible." Clara closed her eyes for 1 second. Now, she thought, would be an excellent time for the phone malfunction. Ethan Blackwood's office was on the 3rd floor of the museum, in a wing the older employees called the Tower, with that strange mixture of admiration and discomfort people reserve for places where important decisions are made and careers are destroyed with equal efficiency. Clara climbed the stairs. The lift was under maintenance, as if the universe itself wanted to make sure she had enough time to regret every choice she had ever made, and stopped in front of the door with the engraved brass plaque. Ethan Blackwood, Director of Conservation. She knocked. "Come in." His voice was exactly as she expected. Controlled. Neutral. The kind of voice that did not waste tone on unnecessary things like emotion. The office was large, but not extravagant. Floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books, arranged first by subject and then by size. Clara noticed that immediately, because it was the kind of detail that said a great deal about a person. A dark wooden desk, perfectly clear, with only 3 items on its surface: a computer, a pen, and a printed sheet of paper. Ethan Blackwood was standing near the window when she entered. He turned slowly, like a man who never needed to hurry because the world inevitably waited for him. Clara was 28 years old and had dated 2 men in her life. The first had been so kind that sometimes she mistook kindness for a lack of personality. The second had been so full of personality that he exhausted her. Neither had prepared her for Ethan Blackwood. He had the kind of face 18th century sculptors would have tried to capture in marble and then placed in a gallery beside Greek gods, leaving visitors unsure whether they were looking at a work of art or a mistake in scale. Tall, broad shoulders that filled out his tailored suit with the indifference of a man who had never once wondered whether clothes looked good on him. Dark hair, slightly disordered in a way that looked calculated, but probably was not. Eyes the color of storm clouds over stone. Clara would learn later that they changed depending on the light, and an expression that combined authority with something harder to name. Distance. That was it. He always looked slightly beyond the reach of anything that might disturb him. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Director Blackwood," she replied, and felt proud that her voice came out steady. He gestured toward the chair in front of the desk. She sat. He returned behind the desk, but did not immediately sit down. For a moment, he stood there, looking at her with an expression that was not exactly cold and not exactly curious, but somewhere uncomfortable between the two. Then he picked up the paper from the desk and placed it in front of her. The message was printed, word for word. Small, clean font. Arial, size 12. As if it were an official document. As if he had considered it serious enough to deserve physical paper. Clara looked at the text, read her own words, felt heat rise up her neck. "I can explain," she began. "That won't be necessary," Ethan said. His voice did not change. "The message is quite clear." She waited to be fired. Waited for the speech about professional conduct. Waited for the polite request to clear out her desk. Waited for the inevitable humiliation of walking through the museum toward the exit, while her colleagues tried not to stare. What he said was, "You start on the Highlands project Monday." Clara blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The Dunmore Castle collection arrived last week," he said, as if they were discussing the weather. 43 pieces, dating from the 17th to the 19th century. Flemish tapestries, Qing dynasty porcelain, 4 oil paintings of uncertain authorship that may or may not be attributed to the Dutch school. "The work will require at least 4 months," he paused. "You'll be working directly with me in Lab B every weekday, starting at 8:30. Clara stared at him. "Is this punishment?" Ethan's expression did not change, but something moved through his eyes, too fast for her to identify with certainty. "It's an opportunity," he said. "For you to prove yesterday's work was merely immature and not representative of your general ability." A pause. "Unless you would prefer I treat this as a conduct issue." She understood. It was not a choice. It was a frame around something he had already decided. "Monday at 8:30, Clara said. 8:15, he corrected. Then he turned his eyes back to his computer, which clearly meant the conversation was over. Clara stood, picked up her bag, crossed the office, opened the door, stepped into the corridor, went down the stairs, reached the second-floor restroom, locked herself inside the furthest stall, sat on the closed toilet lid, and spent exactly 4 minutes breathing deeply before she felt capable of returning to the lab. In that cold restroom, surrounded by white tiles and the faint smell of lavender cleaning product, she made a decision. Ethan Blackwood had decided she would work directly under his supervision. Fine. She would work, and she would work so well that, by the end of those 4 months, he would not be able to find a single word of criticism to say. She did not yet know that it would be exactly this project, exactly this closeness, that would make it impossible to keep pretending the message had been nothing more than a typing mistake. Lab B was in the basement of the museum. It was not gloomy. The lighting was carefully designed, the temperature controlled, the air slightly dry in the way old artifacts required, but it had the kind of silence that underground places always carry, a different silence from the galleries above, where visitors held their breath by choice. The silence of the lab was structural, built into the walls, as if the space itself understood that the work done there demanded total concentration. Clara arrived at 8:12. Ethan was already there. He was leaning over one of the work tables, examining a fragment of tapestry through a magnifying glass, and he did not look up when she entered. She had not expected him to. She hung her coat on the hook near the door, washed her hands, pulled on nitrile gloves, and walked to the second table, where the pieces had been organized by category and state of preservation. "Start with the porcelain from Group 3, Ethan said, without taking his eyes off the tapestry. "There's a preliminary catalog in the blue folder. Check the inventory numbers and tell me if the count matches." "Good morning," Clara said. Silence. "Good morning," he replied, his tone so neutral it could have been anything between a greeting and a concession. She opened the blue folder. The preliminary catalog was dense, detailed, with handwritten notes in the margins in small, precise handwriting she immediately recognized as his. Ethan Blackwood, she was learning, did not do anything halfway. Every note had a date, a time, and a technical observation that revealed both an encyclopedic knowledge of historical materials and an almost physical impatience with any work that failed to reach the same standard of accuracy. Clara worked in silence for 90 minutes, checking each piece against the catalog, photographing irregularities, and writing her own observations in a separate notebook. It was the kind of work she loved. Slow, methodical. That particular satisfaction of finding order inside the chaos of centuries, compressed into physical objects. At 10 o'clock, she said, "Catalog number 42 doesn't match what's here." Ethan looked up for the first time in 90 minutes. "Explain." "The catalog lists a white porcelain bowl with cobalt blue decoration, Kangxi period, approximately 1680 to 1720, she said, turning toward the table. "What we have here is a bowl with similar decoration, but the glaze has a different quality. The shine is more glassy, and the thickness of the wall is inconsistent with the Kangxi period. I'd say it's a 19th century reproduction. A good reproduction," she added, "but a reproduction." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "Do you have training in Chinese porcelain?" Ethan asked. "My master's dissertation was on 19th century forgery techniques in East Asian ceramics," Clara said. "European museums bought a lot of them. Not all of them knew how to verify what they were getting." Another silence. She could not read his expression. He crossed the lab, stood beside her, and looked at the bowl. He picked up the magnifier, examined the glaze in silence for 2 full minutes. Then, "You're right." 3 words, delivered with the same neutrality as everything else he said. But Clara noticed, because she was paying attention in a way she was trying to pretend she was not, that there was something different in the quality of the silence that followed, as if he were recalibrating something internally. "I'll check the acquisition history with the Highlands curator," he said. "Continue with the rest of Group 3. She continued. At 12:30, without preamble, he said, "The coffee is in the break room down the corridor. I use the small machine, not the large one. The large one has had a pressure system issue since August, and no one has repaired it because the maintenance request is trapped somewhere inside the infrastructure department's bureaucracy." Clara looked at him. "Thank you for the information." He had already returned to the tapestry. She went into the corridor, found the break room, used the small machine, and came back with 2 coffees. She placed one beside Ethan's elbow on the table. He said nothing, But when she looked again 15 minutes later, the cup was empty. The weeks that followed established a rhythm. She arrived at 8:15. He was already there. Always. They worked in silence for long periods, interrupted only by technical observations, and occasionally, disagreements. The disagreements were the part Clara had not anticipated. She had expected working under Ethan Blackwood's supervision to mean following his instructions without question, producing the work he required, and receiving his evaluations with the submissive gratitude of someone who knew she was paying for a mistake. She had prepared herself for that. She had decided she could swallow her pride for 4 months. The problem was that Ethan was wrong about the second painting. "It's not Dutch school," Clara said in the 3rd week, looking at the canvas they had spent 2 days examining. "The light registers are different. Dutch painters of that period, Vermeer, de Hooch, even the lesser-known ones, worked with light from a side window, consistent, almost always from the left. Here, the source is ambiguous, diffused. That's more characteristic of Flemish painters working outside the established guilds, possibly someone from Ghent or Bruges." Ethan looked at the painting. "The composition is consistent with Utrecht," he said. "The composition, yes," Clara agreed, "but not the palette. Look at the ochre in the shadows. Utrecht painters used a warmer, yellower ochre. This one is more neutral, almost grayish. Burnt umber mixed with..." She leaned closer. "Probably lead white in an unusual proportion. That's a regional recipe, not a school." Ethan's silence was different from his usual silence. She was starting to distinguish them. There was the silence of concentration when he was processing technical information. There was the silence of disagreement, slightly tighter, with a quality of preparation, like a rebuttal waiting to happen. And then there was this third kind of silence, the rarest one, the one she still had no name for. "I'll verify it through pigment analysis," he said finally. "Wednesday." On Thursday, he placed the preliminary analysis report on the table beside her without saying a word. She read it. The pigments were consistent with the Ghent region, sometime between the 1640s and 1660s. She said nothing. Neither did he. But that afternoon, when she went to the corridor to get coffee, there was already a second cup waiting on the tray when she reached the machine. Ethan had made hers, without asking how she took it, but exactly the way she liked it, because he had been paying attention for the past 2 weeks without her knowing. One of the things nobody tells you about restoration is that the work forces you to pay attention in a way ordinary life does not. You learn to read what is in the margins, the crack that looks superficial, but reveals a deeper structural problem. The layer of varnish hiding an 18th century repaint over a 15th century work. The thread in an embroidery that has been replaced, the slightly different texture, the almost imperceptibly newer shade, by someone who tried to repair damage without leaving a record. Clara was good at that. She always had been. The problem was that the same habit of attention was beginning to operate outside the lab. She was paying attention to Ethan Blackwood, and what she was seeing in the margins was not what she had expected to find. The man who arrived before everyone else, not to demonstrate authority, but because, she gradually realized, the museum in the early morning was the first place in his life where silence felt like pleasure, not loneliness. The man who drank coffee without sugar, who always used the same pen, a simple blue ballpoint from an ordinary brand, completely out of place with everything else about him, who had the habit of running his index finger along the first line of any document before he began reading, as if he needed to physically anchor the text before processing it. The man who avoided praise as if it were a weakness. She saw it happen 3 times during the first weeks. Priya Sharma, the curatorial assistant, showed him a catalog report she had spent 2 weeks completing. It was, objectively, excellent work, organized, detailed, with impeccable cross-references. Ethan looked at it for 3 minutes and said, "Correct." "File it in the main folder." Priya left the office with her face slightly fallen. But later, when Clara passed near Ethan's desk and he was typing an email, she saw, accidentally, or perhaps more deliberately than she wanted to admit, that the subject line was Done more cataloging. Priya Sharma. And the text began. Miss Sharma's cataloging work demonstrates an analytical capacity that exceeds the expected level for her current position. I recommend she be considered for. He had sent the praise in writing, for the official record. Where it mattered, he just couldn't say it out loud. Clara thought about that for 2 days. In the 5th week, the problem with James Whitfield happened. James was the senior curator of the British wing. In his early 40s, easy smile, the kind of charm that worked well at gala events and board meetings, but which hid, Clara was slowly discovering, a competitiveness carefully disguised as collegiality. He appeared in Lab B on a Wednesday afternoon, while Ethan was upstairs in a planning meeting. "Clara," he said with that smile, "how is the Highlands project coming along?" "Well," she said carefully. "The 3rd Flemish tapestry," he said. "Have you started the cleaning process yet?" "Not yet. I'm finishing the structural analysis of the support first." "Ah." He moved closer to the table where the tapestry was spread out. "I was thinking, there's a dry cleaning method some European conservators have been using for textiles from that period. Faster, less invasive for the fibers. I have the protocol here, if you'd like to take a look." He placed a document on the table. Clara picked it up and read it. Something tightened in the pit of her stomach. The protocol was real. She had read about it in specialist publications. But there was a problem with that specific application. The tapestry on her table, she had identified the week before, had wool fibers with a higher than average level of fragility for the period. The fibers had been dyed using a specific process that, in contact with the solvent agent described in the protocol, could cause a reaction that would permanently compromise the textile's structure. It would not be visible immediately. It would take weeks to appear. And when it did, the damage would be blamed on the restoration process, blamed on her. "I'll consider it," Clara said. James left. Clara stared at the protocol for a long moment. Then she opened her notebook and began writing. Every fiber analysis she had performed the previous week, every measurement, every photograph, with date and time. Every piece of documentation proving she had identified the issue before any cleaning process began. She was halfway through the 3rd page when she heard the laboratory door. Ethan had returned from the meeting 15 minutes earlier than expected. He looked at Whitfield's document on the table, then at Clara's notebook, then at her. "Whitfield was here," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "He left this." Ethan picked up the protocol. "Yes." He read the entire document without speaking. Then, "Were you going to use it?" "No," Clara said. "The fibers in this tapestry are sensitive to the solvent agent, in a way that makes the protocol inappropriate. I have all the documentation here." She pointed to the notebook. "I was finishing the organization before bringing it to you." Silence. "Make a copy," he said. 3 copies. One for the project archive, one for the central documentation system, one for me. She looked at him. "Ethan." She used his name without thinking. "No, sir." "No, director." He did not react to the name. But something shifted in his posture, imperceptible, perhaps only visible to someone who had spent 5 weeks paying attention to the margins. 3 copies, he said again, lower this time, and date and time on every page. She understood what he was doing. He was creating an incontestable record, a record that, if Whitfield tried anything, would make it impossible to attribute any damage to Clara. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, before she could stop herself. For a moment, he kept his eyes on the table. "Because it's the correct procedure," he said. Then he went back to his desk. Clara looked at his back for 1 second. Then she opened the drawer, took out a stack of copy sheets, and began writing. Because it's the correct procedure. Maybe. But she had learned how to read what was in the margins. 3 days later, it happened. Clara arrived at the lab at 8:15 to find Ethan already there, standing with his phone in his hand, and an expression that, for the first time since she had met him, looked almost like controlled anger. "Sit down," he said. She sat. James Whitfield presented a report to the curatorial board last night, claiming that Flemish Tapestry No. 3 shows preliminary damage consistent with improper handling during the initial analysis process. Clara stared at him. "That's false," Ethan said. The word came out clean and sharp. "I know it's false. You documented the state of the fibers in enough detail for any independent expert to confirm there was no damage prior to the start of the project." He placed the phone on the table. "But Whitfield is requesting an independent audit and naming you as responsible for the analysis process. I have all the documentation." "I know you do," Ethan said. "I already sent it to the board this morning at 6:45, along with my personal assessment of the tapestry's condition and a note regarding the protocol Whitfield suggested on Wednesday, including a technical analysis explaining why its application would have been inappropriate for that specific material." Clara went silent. "You already sent it?" "Before you arrived." She processed that. "You knew he was going to do this." It was not a question, but Ethan answered anyway. "Whitfield attempted something similar with an external restorer 18 months ago. Different protocol, different piece, same intended result." He paused. "The restorer did not have enough documentation. The damage was attributed to the restoration process. His career did not survive it." Clara's stomach dropped. "And you knew that when you put me on this project." "I knew Whitfield was interested in the Highlands collection," Ethan said. "And I knew you had identified the fiber issue without being asked." He looked at her with that expression she still did not fully know how to name. "Documentation is protection. You understood that instinctively." Clara stared at him. "You could have warned me." "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you?" A pause long enough for her to know he was choosing his answer carefully. "Because I wanted to know whether you would act correctly without knowing you were being tested." She did not know whether she felt anger or something more complicated. And you did," he said simply. The curatorial board closed the audit 2 days later, before it had even properly begun, based on Ethan's documentation. Whitfield was called into a meeting with the museum's director general and came out visibly quieter than when he had entered. Clara did not ask what had been said in that meeting, but Priya, the curatorial assistant, whispered to her in the corridor. "Blackwood walked into that meeting with a dossier, not just about the tapestry, about the case from 18 months ago, too." Priya paused. "I've never seen him like that. He was completely calm. You know how he is. But there was something. He wasn't going to let it pass." Clara returned to the lab. Ethan was examining the 4th painting, the one they still had not been able to attribute with certainty. She sat at the table beside him, picked up the gloves, and opened the catalog. "Thank you," she said without looking at him. Silence. "Continue with Group 4, he said. But she saw, because she was paying attention to the margins, that the tension in his shoulders had eased slightly since that morning. It was the 10th week of the project when the security system failed. It had been a long day, An external consultant had come in to examine the paintings, and the meeting had stretched until 6:30 in the evening. Then everyone left: the consultant, the assistants, Priya, the day shift security guards. And Clara was finishing a report while Ethan was. Clara did not know where Ethan was. She had not heard his footsteps in the corridor for 40 minutes. Then she heard the sound, a soft electronic click, a low hum. Then the total silence of the emergency lights going out. The corridor went dark. "Miss Bennett." Ethan's voice came from somewhere to the left, in the corridor between the lab and the old exhibition wing. "Here," she answered. She heard his steps approaching. Then the light from his phone appeared in the corridor, weak but enough. "The main system failed," he said, when he was close enough for her to see him. "The backup system should have activated automatically. It didn't. How long until night security gets here?" "They've been notified," he said, "but there's traffic on the Royal Mile because of an event. Estimated arrival is 45 minutes to an hour." Clara looked at the dark corridor around them. The display cases in the old wing, barely visible under the faint, battery-powered lights that still worked in some of them, created small islands of pale, spectral light in the darkness. "I know this museum," she said, "since I was 10. My mother used to bring me here every summer when we visited Scotland." Ethan was silent for a moment. "You're not Scottish?" "No, I'm from Brighton." A pause. "My grandmother was from Edinburgh. She died when I was 11. After that, we stopped coming." She did not know why she had said it. The darkness, perhaps. The darkness, and the silence, and those 45 minutes. And the fact that after 10 weeks of working side by side with Ethan Blackwood, she still knew surprisingly little about him, while he, unwillingly, had learned more about her than most people. "Let's go to the control room in Corridor B," Ethan said. "There's a manual backup system that can be activated locally." They walked through the dark corridor by the light of his phone. The old wing had that quality all museums have at night. Not exactly frightening, but strangely more alive, as if the displayed objects recovered something in the absence of daytime eyes. The medieval armor, the reliquaries, the 16th and 17th century portraits, with eyes that seemed to follow movement. Clara had grown up without being afraid of museums at night, but she was aware of Ethan walking beside her. The distance between them was the same as always: professional, calculated, and yet somehow different in the dark. More present, more real. They reached the control room. Ethan tried the panel, then tried again. "The manual backup has a fault as well," he said. His tone was neutral, but she could hear, now, the variations she had learned to distinguish. There was frustration there, very controlled. "So we're trapped here," she said, "for approximately 45 minutes. They returned to the main corridor, where the battery-lit display cases created that spectral glow. There was a wooden bench against the wall, the kind of museum bench that existed less for comfort, and more so elderly visitors or people with bad knees could rest. They sat. The silence between them was different from all the silences of the lab. "Did you always know you wanted conservation?" she asked after a few minutes. He did not answer right away. "No," he said. "I started with art history, classical archaeology specifically." A pause. "But I thought, archaeology puts you in relation to what has been lost. Conservation puts you in relation to what can still be saved." Clara looked at him from the side. It was the most personal thing he had said in 10 weeks. "You lost something," she said. Not as an accusation, as an observation. The silence that followed was long enough for her to think she had crossed a line. "My father was a collector," he said finally. Not a museum collector. The kind of collector who bought out of passion without verifying provenance, authenticity, or condition. When he died, there were 426 pieces in his house. A pause. 187 were forgeries. 43 were in a state of irreversible deterioration. 22 years of life, passion, money, and more than half of it had been lost because the right knowledge was missing. Clara said nothing. How old were you? 22, finishing university. And that's when you changed to conservation. Not immediately, he said. First, I tried to save what I could of his collection. The smallest smile appeared, so brief she almost missed it. That was when I realized I was good at it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the message I sent, she said. By mistake. She felt him become slightly still beside her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, Clara said. But I want to. A pause. What I wrote, the part about you being arrogant and unbearable. It was true when I wrote it, but it wasn't the whole story. The silence between them changed. And now, he said, very quietly. Clara looked at the display cases ahead of them, at the reflection of the two of them in the dark glass, the weak lights around the artifacts, creating a negative version of who they were during the day. Now I know you arrive before everyone else, because the museum early in the morning is the only place where you can think without the armor, she said. That you take your coffee without sugar, because you grew up without many vices, and that one isn't worth having. That you don't praise people out loud because someone, at some point, taught you that praise was a concession. She paused. And that when you decided to put me on the Highlands project, it wasn't punishment. It was because you had read my first-day report more than twice. She felt him look at her. How do you know that? Because there were rereading marks in the margins, she said. I saw them when you returned the report to me. Silence. Ethan, she said. His name. Just his name. No title. No professional distance. It was the second time she had used his name like that. The first had been in the lab, by accident. This time, it was entirely intentional. He turned toward her. In the darkness of the museum, with the display lights creating that impossible glow around them, Clara saw something on Ethan Blackwood's face she had never seen during their 10 weeks in the lab. The distance had disappeared. Not all of it. He was who he was, and she was beginning to understand that his reserve was not arrogance, but something closer to caution about what he allowed in. But the distance between him and the world, the distance that made employees straighten their backs when he passed, the distance that had made her write that message on the first night, that distance was gone. Since that night, he said, in a voice Clara had never heard from him before, lower and more direct than anything he had ever said in the lab, I haven't been able to forget a single word. Clara stared at him. The message? The message, he confirmed. Not because it was embarrassing, because it was true. Everything you wrote. A pause. And I didn't know what to do with that. With what? With someone who saw me clearly enough to write that, he said, and still walked into the lab on Monday morning and worked as if the mistake had never happened. Clara was silent for a moment. I needed the job, she said. At first, he agreed. And after that, she looked at him. And Ethan Blackwood, the man who controlled every word, every gesture, every carefully measured distance, looked back at her with an expression she finally had a name for. It was not arrogance. It had never been arrogance. It was the expression of someone who had learned, at some painful point in life, that caring for something very carefully was the only true protection against losing it. And who, in that moment, was considering with all the seriousness in the world whether he was ready to apply that same care to something that could not be archived in a catalog or documented in a report. Ethan, she said again. Clara, he said. and the difference between the way he had said Miss Bennet for the first time, 10 weeks earlier in that third-floor office, and the way he said her name now, in the dark, surrounded by the spectral light of the display cases, was the difference between an archived document and something alive. The security guards arrived 52 minutes later. The lights returned. The museum became the museum again. The marble corridors, the centuries-old portraits, the Egyptian sarcophagi, the medieval armor, and the 4 dozen pieces from the Highlands collection still waiting for restoration in Lab B. They went back to normal. Or something close to normal. But normal had changed meaning? The next morning, Clara arrived at the lab at 8:15. Ethan was already there. He did not look up immediately when she came in. She did not expect him to. She hung up her coat, washed her hands, and put on her gloves. But before going to her table, she walked to the coffee machine in the corridor and came back with 2 cups. She placed his beside his elbow. He looked up. "No sugar," she said. Something moved across Ethan's face, very quickly, but she was paying attention. "Thank you," he said. She went to her table, opened the catalog, started working. At 10:20, without lifting his eyes from the tapestry he was examining, he said, "There's a concert at Queen's Hall on Friday. Baroque chamber music." A pause. "If you don't have other plans." Clara looked up from the catalog. Ethan was looking at her, not with the expression of professional authority she had learned to decode over the past 10 weeks, with another expression, the one she had seen only once before in the darkness of the museum, while rain passed outside and the security system remained inactive, and the distance between them had narrowed into something that was no longer professional or safe. The expression of a man who had decided. "I don't have other plans," Clara said. Ethan Blackwood looked at her for 1 second, longer than anything professional required. Then he returned his eyes to the tapestry. 8 o'clock, he said. Clara smiled down at the open catalog in front of her. Because that is the thing about the kind of mistakes that change everything. You do not plan them. You do not choose them. They arrive at the wrong time, for the wrong reason, to the most unlikely person. But when they reach the right person, when the message sent by mistake reaches the one it was meant for, even if you did not know it, there is nothing left to do except recognize what was written in the margins. Clara Bennett was 28 years old. She had a tiny flat near the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, a job she loved in a museum she had first visited when she was 10 years old with her mother, and a message sent by mistake that had changed absolutely everything. And on Friday, she was going to a Baroque music concert with the most impossible, most demanding, most reserved, and most unexpectedly gentle man who had ever entered her life. Because some stories begin with a typing mistake and end with everything exactly where it was meant to be.